The year was 1885, and the world was the color of rust. In the town of Red Mesa, the dust was a third citizen, after people and their ghosts. It settled in the lines of a man's face, coated the tongues of thirsty horses, and gathered in the corners of every room, a fine red powder that tasted of iron and endless distance. The town itself was little more than a scar on the land, clinging to the base of the towering red rock formations that gave it a name and a spine, while its face was turned toward the sun-blasted emptiness of the Sonoran Desert. A new railroad was rumored to be cutting its way west, a steel serpent that would change everything. But for now, Red Mesa existed in a state of gritty suspense. It was a place where the law was a long ride away, and a man's worth was measured in the speed of his draw and the weight of his silence. Eleanor Hayes knew the silence well. At 28, she was a widow, a title that felt both too old and too new for her shoulders. She was the proprietor of the Dusty Spur, a saloon and way station that served as the town's weary heart. It was a place built of sweat-stained timber and sturdy enough to withstand the brawls of prospectors and the lonely drinking of cattlemen. Eleanor ran it with a resolve that men mistook for hardness. They saw the straight line of her back, the way she could pour a whiskey without her hand trembling as a fight broke out, and the cool assessment in her gray eyes. They did not see the woman who, in the dead of night, would trace the rim of an empty teacup. Remembering a husband the desert had swallowed 4 years prior, Samuel had been a good man, a gentle man, and the West had broken him as easily as a dry twig. It had not broken Eleanor. It had fired her in a kiln of grief and necessity, leaving her stronger, but brittle. Her days were a rhythm of routine. She would rise before the sun painted the mesas in hues of rose and gold, the air still holding a remnant of the night's chill. She would sweep the floor, the broom whispering secrets to the dust. She would wipe down the long bar, its surface a map of knife scars and condensation rings. She would check her dwindling supplies, making a mental list for the next freight wagon, whenever that might be. The town itself was a collection of souls clinging to the edge of civilization. There was Sheriff Miller, a man whose authority was mostly symbolic, Jebediah Smith, the blacksmith, whose hammer-striking anvil was the town's morning bell, and a handful of families who tried to scratch a living from the ungenerous soil. They were all bound by a shared isolation, a quiet understanding that survival here was a daily negotiation with God and the elements. This particular afternoon, the elements were winning. The sky, a placid blue an hour ago, had turned a bruised yellow. A wind began to moan through the gaps in the canyon walls, a low, mournful sound that promised violence. Eleanor squinted at the horizon. A wall of red was coming, a churning cloud of dust that would soon devour the town. She had seen such storms before. They scoured the paint from buildings, blinded cattle, and drove people to the brink of madness with their relentless grit and noise. She moved with purpose, her skirt whipping around her ankles. She latched the heavy shutters over the saloon's windows, plunging the interior into a dim, dusty twilight. She secured the door to the stable, her 2 horses shifting nervously in their stalls. The wind was a physical force now, pushing against her, tearing at the pins in her auburn hair until strands of it flew wild around her face. One of the large water barrels by the side of the building had a loose lid, and she wrestled with it, the wood rough against her palms, trying to fasten it before the storm filled it with sand instead of the precious rainwater it was meant to collect. It was then that she saw him. He was little more than a shape in the swirling chaos, a darker smudge against the red earth. He lay at the edge of her property, near a cluster of stubborn, thorny mesquite. Had the storm not been so fierce, she might have missed him entirely, or dismissed him as a fallen log or a trick of the light. But something in the unnatural stillness of his form snagged her attention. It was the specific stillness of a body that has surrendered. Every instinct, honed by years of solitude and caution, screamed at her to go back inside. Lock the door. Wait for the storm to pass. Whatever lay out there was the desert's business, not hers. The desert was a graveyard for the unlucky and the unprepared. But Samuel's face flashed in her mind, his eyes pleading as the fever took him. She had been helpless then. Cursing herself, her own stubborn heart, she leaned into the wind and fought her way toward the shape. The grit stung her eyes and coated her throat. As she drew closer, the shape resolved into a man, an Apache. His black hair was a tangled mat of dust and something dark and wet. He lay face down, one arm flung out as if reaching for something that was not there. He wore buckskin leggings and was naked from the waist up, his back and shoulders a canvas of lean muscle. Now slack in unconsciousness, a deep, ragged gash tore across his side, a wound that was still sluggishly weeping blood into the thirsty ground. Eleanor's breath caught in her chest. This was worse than trouble. This was a death warrant. The cavalry had been through just last week, their faces grim, their horses lathered. They were hunting a renegade, an Apache warrior accused of killing a lieutenant near the San Carlos reservation. They had warned everyone. Their words clipped and cold, any person found aiding the fugitive would be treated as an accomplice, a hanging offense. She should turn back. Now, forget what she saw. The storm would cover him, and by morning, he would be just another secret the desert kept. It was the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. She knelt. Her fingers, hesitant at first, touched his neck. A pulse, faint, thready, but there, a life clinging to its last ember. She could not just leave him. She did not know why. Perhaps it was seeing another human being so utterly broken by this land that had taken so much from her. Perhaps it was a flicker of rebellion against the soldiers and their cold laws, against a world that had become so hard and unforgiving. Making the decision was one thing, acting on it was another. He was a tall man, and though lean, he was solid muscle and bone. She was strong, but he was a dead weight. Gritting her teeth against the screaming wind, she hooked her arms under his shoulders and pulled. He did not move. She tried again, digging her heels into the soft earth, her muscles straining, slowly, agonizingly. She began to drag him. It was a brutal, desperate journey of 20 yards, a journey that felt like a mile. The storm raged around them, a world of sound and fury that mercifully hid her struggle from any prying eyes. His body left a shallow furrow in the sand. Her lungs burned. Her arms ached with a fire that spread to her back and shoulders. By the time she reached the back door of the saloon, the one that led to the small storeroom, she was slick with sweat and grime, and her dress was stained with his blood. With a final, heaving sob of effort, she pulled him over the threshold and into the relative quiet of the building. She slumped against the closed door, her heart hammering against her ribs, listening to the muffled howl of the wind outside. The world she had known, the small, precarious peace she had built for herself, had ended the moment she touched him. Inside the storeroom, the air was thick with the smell of sacked grain, old wood, and now, blood. By the dim light filtering through the cracks in the walls, she examined him more closely. He was younger than she first thought, perhaps her own age. His face, even slack and pale beneath its bronze skin, was all sharp angles and defiant lines. A proud face, a warrior's face. There was a long, faded scar that cut through one eyebrow, a testament to some past battle. His injuries were severe. The wound in his side looked like it came from a bullet, torn and angry. There were other cuts and bruises covering his torso, signs of a desperate fight or a long fall. She worked quickly, her fear giving way to a focused urgency. She fetched a basin of water and clean rags from her living quarters upstairs, moving silently through the empty saloon. She gently cleaned the wound, her touch surprisingly steady. The water turned pink, then red. As she worked, she felt a strange intimacy, a connection to this stranger that transcended race and circumstance. She was touching his pain, his vulnerability. She saw not an Apache renegade, but a man, broken and bleeding on her floor. She found the bullet. It was lodged just beneath the skin on the far side of the wound. using the tip of a small, sharp knife she had sterilized in the flame of a lantern. She carefully, clumsily, worked it free. The man groaned, a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the floorboards, and his body tensed. She froze, her breath held tight in her chest, but he did not wake. After she had bandaged his side with strips torn from a clean sheet, she wiped the grime from his face. The planes of his cheeks were high and strong, his mouth firm even in unconsciousness. He was, she realized with a jolt that had nothing to do with fear, a handsome man. The thought was so inappropriate, so dangerous, that she pushed it away immediately. She was a widow. He was a fugitive. She was a white woman. He was an Apache. They were on opposite sides of a war she did not understand, but whose consequences were bleeding all over her storeroom floor. As if summoned by her thoughts, his eyes fluttered open. They were not black, as she had expected, but a deep, dark brown, the color of wet earth at midnight. For a moment, they were unfocused, clouded with pain. Then they found her. They cleared, sharpened, and locked onto her face with a startling intensity. There was no gratitude in that gaze, only a fierce, primal suspicion. It was the look of a cornered wolf, assessing the threat, calculating the odds. His eyes held a universe of questions she could not answer. Who are you? Why are you helping me? Are you the one who will kill me? Eleanor found she could not look away. She was trapped in the raw power of his stare. In that moment, the storm outside, the town, the soldiers, all of it faded away. There was only the small, dim room, the smell of blood and dust, and the silent, desperate communion between two strangers from worlds that were meant to be at war. The red dust from the storm had settled on the dark smears of blood on his skin, a testament to the land that had wounded him, and his eyes. They clung to her, as if she were the only solid thing in a world that was dissolving into chaos. It was as if neither of them could pull away, bound by a wound and a question that had no words. Then, as quickly as it came, the light in his eyes dimmed, his eyelids slid shut, and he was gone again, back into the depths of unconsciousness. Eleanor let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding. Her hands were trembling. She stood up, her legs unsteady, and looked down at the man who was now her terrible, dangerous secret. The storm was beginning to subside, its fury spent. A heavy silence descended on Red Mesa, a silence that was now filled with the sound of a stranger's labored breathing. She had saved his life, and in doing so, she had likely forfeited her own. The day after the storm, Red Mesa awoke to a world scrubbed clean. The wind had scoured the dust from the air, leaving the sky a piercing, unforgiving blue. But a new kind of grit had settled over the town. A particle of rumor, small and sharp. It started with a child who claimed to have seen a shadow move through the gale, a shape that did not belong. The whisper passed from a woman hanging laundry to her neighbor, then to the general store, where it was weighed and measured like flour. An Apache, they said, wounded, hiding somewhere in the rocks, or maybe even closer. By noon, the rumor had taken root, a poisonous weed in the town's collective mind, fed by a deep-seated fear of the people whose land this had once been. Eleanor heard the whispers when she opened the saloon for the day. She kept her face a mask of neutrality, her movements calm and measured as she polished glasses behind the bar. Inside, her heart was a trapped bird, beating its wings against the cage of her ribs. The Apache was still in her storeroom, lying on a pallet of old blankets, drifting in and out of a fever that left his skin hot to the touch. She had managed to get some water into him, but little else. His silence was as profound as the desert night, a heavy, watchful presence on the other side of the wall. Late in the afternoon, the sound of hoofbeats reached the town. Too many and too uniformed to be prospectors or a passing stagecoach. Eleanor looked out the window, and her blood ran cold. A column of cavalry, their blue uniforms stark against the red landscape. rode down the town's only street. They moved with an arrogant certainty, their faces set and grim. At their head rode Captain Jonas Murdoch. Eleanor had known Jonas for years. He had been stationed at the nearby fort before Samuel's death, a handsome and ambitious officer with eyes the color of a winter sky and a smile that never quite reached them. He had made his intentions toward her clear, both before and after she was widowed. Pursuing her with a dogged persistence, she found more chilling than flattering. His interest in her felt like an attempted acquisition, as if she were a parcel of land to be claimed and fenced in. His presence now, as the embodiment of the law, felt like a personal and profound threat. He dismounted in front of the dusty spur, his spurs jingling with a sound of metallic authority. He handed his reins to a subordinate and strode into the saloon, his shadow falling long across the floorboards. "Captain Murdoch," Eleanor said, her voice even. She did not allow it to tremble. "What brings the army to our quiet corner of the world?" He removed his hat, revealing perfectly combed blonde hair. "Routine patrol, Eleanor. And a bit of business. I am sure you have heard the talk. An Apache fugitive. Killed a good officer. We have reason to believe he came this way." Eleanor continued to wipe a glass, her knuckles white. "Talk is cheap in Red Mesa. Captain, it is all we can afford." His eyes scanned the saloon, missing nothing. He walked the length of the room, his boots loud in the tense silence. His gaze lingered on the door to the storeroom. "And what is behind this door?" "Supplies," she said, her tone clipped. "Grain, barrels, and a family of rats I have been meaning to poison. I would not recommend going in there. The smell is something fierce." Jonas smiled that cold smile again. "A resourceful woman like you. Bested by a few rats, I find that hard to believe." He took a step toward the door. "I think I will have a look all the same. Procedure. You understand." Eleanor's mind raced. The Apache was weak, but if a soldier burst in, his warrior instincts might take over. There would be a fight, a killing. Her own life would be over. She had to stop him. She moved from behind the bar, placing herself between Jonas and the door. "Captain, I have nothing to hide, but I am a woman running a business alone. That storeroom is a mess of my own making, and I will not have you or your men tracking boot prints through it. If you wish to search my property, you will need to present me with more than just a rumor." It was a gamble, a direct challenge to his authority. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, his blue eyes searching her face for any flicker of deceit. She met his gaze without flinching, pouring all of her terror into a cold, hard defiance. The air crackled between them, thick with their shared past and the unspoken danger of the present. Finally, a corner of his mouth twitched. "Very well, Eleanor. For now. But make no mistake, we are not leaving Red Mesa until this business is concluded. I will be speaking with everyone. If you hear anything at all, I expect you to remember where your loyalties lie." He turned and walked out, the threat hanging in the air long after he was gone. Eleanor leaned against the bar, her legs suddenly weak. She had bought herself a few hours, perhaps a day, but Jonas Murdoch was not a man who gave up easily. Later, when the moon was high and the town was asleep, she took a bowl of thin broth and a fresh cup of water into the storeroom. The man was awake. His dark eyes followed her as she approached. He had pushed himself up into a sitting position, his back against a stack of flour sacks. The effort had clearly cost him. A sheen of sweat covered his face. He watched as she set the bowl down, his expression a mixture of feverish confusion and deep-seated mistrust. She knelt a few feet away, keeping a safe distance. "You need to eat," she said softly. He said nothing, his gaze unwavering. It was unnerving, like being studied by an animal that saw her not as a person, but as a potential danger. Why, the word was a dry rasp, torn from a throat unused to speaking her language. Eleanor dipped a cloth in the cool water and held it out to him. "Because you were dying." she replied simply. He flinched when she reached for his forehead, but she touched the damp cloth to his skin anyway. His fever was still dangerously high. People do not get to choose who they save in the middle of the desert. His eyes narrowed, searching her face for the lie, for the trap. His world was one of betrayal and violence, a place where kindness from a white woman was a thing of myth. He had been a scout for the army, forced into it, living between two worlds and belonging to neither. He had seen the casual cruelty of the soldiers, the contempt in their eyes. He had seen his own people herded like cattle onto reservations, their spirits slowly choked out of them. He had killed the lieutenant, yes, but only after the man had struck a helpless old woman. He had run, knowing it was a death sentence. To wake up here, in this dark room, at the mercy of one of them, felt like a trick of the fevered mind. He hated her for the debt he now owed her, a debt his pride could barely stomach. Eleanor felt the turmoil radiating from him, the battle between his ingrained hatred and his current helplessness. She was afraid, not just of the law, but of him. He was a force of nature, a piece of the wild, untamable land she so respected and feared. And yet, she was drawn to him, to the fierce dignity that even pain and fever could not extinguish. It was a foolish, dangerous feeling, and she fought against it with every ounce of her good sense. For 2 days, this was their rhythm. She would tend to his wound, bring him food and water he barely touched, and they would exist in a state of tense, watchful silence. The soldiers were a constant presence in the town, questioning everyone, their frustration mounting. Jonas visited the saloon each day, his visits a blend of official inquiry and unwelcome courtship. Each time, Eleanor felt like she was walking a wire over a canyon. On the 3rd night, a storm rolled in, not of dust, but of rain and thunder. The sky broke open, and the sound of the downpour was a welcome noise, muffling the sounds of the town. A few prospectors, driven inside by the weather, sat nursing their whiskeys. One of them, a burly man named Silas with a mean streak and hands like shovels, had been drinking steadily for hours. Eleanor had been keeping an eye on him, her body tense. As the night wore on and the other customers drifted away, Silas remained. When she finally called for him to settle his tab, he lurched toward her. "Now, Eleanor," he slurred, a foul grin on his face. "No need to be in such a hurry. It is just you and me. A lonely widow like you must get tired of sleeping alone." He reached for her, his heavy hand closing around her wrist. Eleanor tried to pull away, her heart seizing with a familiar, cold fear. "Get your hands off me, Silas." He just laughed, his grip tightening. "Or what you will call the sheriff. He is probably drunker than I am." He started to pull her from behind the bar. She struggled, her feet slipping on the floorboards, but he was too strong. Panic began to claw at her throat. Suddenly, the door to the storeroom creaked open. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was the Apache. He was unsteady on his feet, one hand pressed to the fresh bandage on his side. He was still weak, still feverish, but his eyes burned with a cold fire. He moved without a sound, a specter of vengeance in the lamplit room. Silas stopped, his drunken grin faltering as he saw the man. He let go of Eleanor's arm. "What in damnation is this?" The Apache did not speak. He simply stood there, his presence filling the room, his gaze fixed on Silas with an unnerving intensity. In that moment, he was not a wounded fugitive. He was a warrior. Just as Silas was reaching for the pistol at his belt, a tremendous clap of thunder shook the entire building. At the same instant, a bolt of lightning lit up the sky outside, flashing through the saloon windows. For a split second, the room was bathed in a stark, blue-white light. In that flash, Eleanor saw him. The light threw the planes of his face into sharp relief and illuminated his bare chest. Across his heart, stretching from his sternum to his shoulder, was a terrible, ancient scar. It was not the clean line of a knife, but a jagged, puckered ruin of flesh, the kind of mark left by an unimaginable wound. a wound that should have killed him. It was a scar that spoke of a loss so profound it had been carved directly into his body. The light died, plunging the room back into the warm glow of the lamps. Silas, thoroughly spooked by the sudden appearance of the Apache and the crack of thunder, backed away. "I ain't looking for this kind of trouble," he muttered, and stumbled out into the rain-swept night. Eleanor was left alone with the warrior. She was shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She did not know if she trembled from fear of Silas or from the startling, powerful presence of the man before her. He took a hesitant step toward her, and she flinched. He stopped immediately. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and gravelly, like stones shifting in a dry creek bed. "I do not harm the one who saved me." She looked into his eyes, and in their depth she saw not a threat, but a promise. The fever was still there, but so was a clarity, a solemn vow. The salt of her fear and the iron of his blood had mixed in that room, and something new had been forged between them. She did not know his name, she did not know his story, but in the thunderous quiet of that night, she believed him. The cavalry left Red Mesa as they had arrived, in a column of blue and a cloud of dust, but their departure did not bring relief. It left behind a residue of suspicion, a fine powder of fear that settled in the town's quiet corners. Captain Jonas Murdoch had been the last to leave. He had stopped at the dusty spur for a final time, his presence filling the saloon with a cold authority. He had asked about the prospector, Silas, noting his sudden absence after the night of the storm. Eleanor had answered with a calm she did not feel, saying that men like Silas were tumbleweeds, blowing in and out on the winds of thirst and luck. Jonas had watched her, his gaze sharp and assessing, and when he left, he had let his eyes linger on the storeroom door one last time. The unspoken message was clear: this was not over. With the soldiers gone, a strange and fragile peace descended upon the saloon. The man whose name she still did not know began to heal. The fever receded, leaving him weak but lucid. He moved from the storeroom to the small cot in her upstairs living quarters, a transition that felt both necessary and monumental. His presence was a constant, humming undercurrent in her life. During the day, while she worked in the saloon below, she was acutely aware of him, a secret she carried in the silence between pouring drinks and wiping down tables. At night, the house was filled with the sound of their separate breathing, two solitary souls under one roof, separated by a thin wooden floor but bound by a shared, dangerous secret. The first real change between them came a week after the storm. He was stronger now, able to stand and walk for short periods, his movements economical and filled with a latent power. One night, long after the moon had risen, he came downstairs. He was dressed in a pair of Samuel's old trousers and a plain shirt, clothes that fit his lean frame awkwardly. He did not look at her. "But at the front door, I must go out," he said, his voice still rough. Eleanor's heart clenched. "Go out where it is not safe." "There is a thing I must do." She saw the resolve in his face, a hard certainty that would not be swayed. She knew arguing was useless. She only nodded, her throat tight. "Be careful." He was gone for over an hour. Eleanor sat at one of the saloon tables, a cold cup of tea in her hands, her ears straining against the night's silence. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of the wind, was the sound of discovery, of a gunshot. When he finally returned, he was carrying a burden in his arms, wrapped in a tattered blanket. He laid it gently on the floor. It was the body of a man, an old Apache, his face peaceful in death, but his chest was riddled with a spray of buckshot. "He was shot from behind," the warrior said, his voice flat and empty, like a dog. "The soldiers did this. I found his trail. They did not even bother to bury him." Eleanor stared at the old man, and a wave of sickness and sorrow washed over her. This was the reality of the war she had stumbled into. It was not just soldiers hunting a fugitive. It was this, a nameless, faceless brutality. An old man left for the coyotes. "We cannot leave him here," she whispered. "No, we give him back to the earth." And so, in the dead of night, under a sky littered with cold, distant stars, they buried the old man. They carried him to a small, sheltered spot behind the saloon, where the red rock met the stubborn desert soil. They took turns with the shovel, the work hard and grueling in the rocky ground. They did not speak. There was nothing to say that the rhythmic scrape and thud of the shovel could not. It was a shared act of defiance, of decency in a world that had little of either. As they worked, the dirt mingling with their sweat, a bond was forged between them, something stronger and deeper than gratitude or fear. It was a partnership born of a shared secret and a common act of mourning. When they were finished, standing over the simple, unmarked mound of earth, he finally spoke. "My name is Taza." She looked at him, his face illuminated by the pale moonlight. The name felt right. It had the sound of the wind moving through rock. "Eleanor," she said, giving him her own name in return, in the quiet of the makeshift graveyard. They were no longer a white woman and an Apache renegade. They were Taza and Eleanor. In the days that followed, the walls between them began to crumble, brick by slow brick. The world outside remained a threat, but inside the saloon, they carved out a small space of their own. Their shared secret became a garden where a tentative trust began to grow. As Taza's strength returned, a new dynamic emerged. One afternoon, he found her staring out at the desert, her brow furrowed with worry. "You look, but you do not see," he said, his voice quiet. "What is there to see but dust and rock?" she asked. "Everything." He led her outside, to the soft earth behind the stables. He knelt and pointed to a series of marks she would have overlooked entirely. "A coyote," he said, his finger tracing the faint print. "See how its back paw falls on the print of the front. It is moving at ease, not hunting, not frightened. And here," he pointed to a single, deep track. "A lone rider, a heavy man on a tired horse. He passed this morning, heading west." He began to teach her the language of the land. He showed her how a bent twig could tell of a passing deer, how the flight of a hawk could signal water, how the scent of the air could predict the weather. She was a clumsy student at first, her eyes unaccustomed to such subtle signs, but she learned. She began to see the desert not as a barren enemy, but as a living thing, full of stories and secrets for those who knew how to read them. And in teaching her, Taza began to open up. He spoke of the spirits of the mountains and the whispers of the wind, sharing pieces of a world she had never known existed. In return, she offered him a piece of her own. She saw the frustration in his eyes when he looked at the newspapers that arrived on the weekly stagecoach, the lines of black ink a code he could not decipher. "I can teach you," she offered one evening, laying a piece of paper and a charcoal pencil on the table. He looked at the pencil as if it were a snake. "I have no need for the white man's marks." "Words are power. Taza," she said gently. "They can be a weapon or a map. They let you speak across time and distance. Let me show you." Hesitantly, he sat. She took his hand, a hand that was calloused from holding a bow and a knife, and guided it to form the first letter of his name. His skin was warm, his touch sending a jolt through her that was both startling and strangely comforting. The act was intensely intimate. She was so close she could feel the warmth of his breath, smell the faint scent of sage and clean sweat that clung to him. He was a slow and painstaking student, his brow furrowed in concentration as he mimicked the shapes she drew, when he finally wrote his own name. Taza, without her help. A slow, rare smile touched his lips. It transformed his face, chasing away the shadows of pain and sorrow, and Eleanor felt her own heart lift in response. But their fragile peace could not last. The world was still out there, waiting. Taza grew restless. His wound was nearly healed, and the strength had returned to his limbs. He was a warrior, a man of the open spaces, and the confines of the saloon were beginning to feel like a cage. He would stand for hours at the upstairs window, his gaze fixed on the distant mesas, a profound longing in his eyes. The breaking point came on a hot, still afternoon. A rider had come through that morning, a prospector heading east. He had spoken of a new bounty, a handsome sum for the Apache who had killed a cavalry officer. The news spread through the saloon like a fever, and Eleanor had seen the greedy glint in the eyes of the few men at the bar. She knew Taza had heard it too. That evening, he met her at the bottom of the stairs, a small bundle in his hand. "I am leaving," he said. There was no room for argument in his voice. Eleanor's blood ran cold. "Leaving? Where will you go? They are looking for you. There is a price on your head now." "That is why I must leave. I have brought enough danger to your door. Every day I stay here. The rope around your neck grows tighter." "No," she said, shaking her head, a desperate denial rising in her throat. "You are not well enough. You cannot survive out there alone." "I have survived worse." He started to move past her, toward the door. She blocked his path, her body trembling. "You cannot just leave." "I must. It is the only way to protect you." "Protect me?" Her voice rose, laced with a raw, ragged edge she did not recognize. "You think leaving me here to face Murdoch and the rest of them alone is protecting me? You think running off into the desert to get yourself killed is protecting me?" She could feel the tears welling in her eyes, hot and angry. It was not fair. The world had already taken one man she cared for. It was not allowed to take another. "You do not understand," he said, his voice tight with a frustration of his own. "I understand that you are being a selfish fool," she cried, the words tumbling out, fueled by weeks of fear and a depth of feeling she had refused to acknowledge until this very moment. "I saved your life. You owe me more than this. You cannot just walk away. It is because you saved my life that I must go." The dam of her control finally broke. A sob escaped her lips, a sound of pure anguish and rage. And then, without thinking, she raised her hand. She slapped him. The sound of it was shockingly loud in the quiet room. Her palm connected with the hard line of his jaw. It was not a blow of anger, but of utter, desperate despair. Her hand was shaking so badly she could barely keep it at her side. She stared at him, horrified at what she had done, the hot tears finally spilling over and streaming down her face. She expected anger, a flash of violence in his dark eyes. She expected him to turn and walk away forever. He did not move. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable for a long moment. Then, slowly, a smile touched his lips. It was not a smile of amusement. It was a sad, knowing smile, a smile that saw straight through her anger to the terrified, breaking heart beneath it. He saw that her slap was not a blow of rejection, but a plea. She slapped him tremblingly. The warrior Apache smiled and drew her against his heart. He reached out and pulled her to him, his arms closing around her in an embrace that was both powerful and gentle. She collapsed against his chest, her fists clenched against his shirt, her sobs shaking her entire body. He held her tight, one hand stroking her hair, his chin resting on the top of her head. He said nothing, simply held her as the storm of her grief and fear finally broke. In the circle of his arms, Eleanor felt not a captive, but for the first time in 4 long years. Safe. It was a desperate, impossible kind of safety, but it was real. Their love, unspoken and unnamed, had finally been acknowledged, not in a gentle whisper, but in a moment of violent, trembling truth. The decision not to leave had altered the very air in the saloon. It was no longer a sanctuary, but a shared foxhole. The unspoken love between Taza and Eleanor was a fragile candle flame in a vast darkness, and they both knew a single gust of wind could extinguish it. Their days were a careful dance of quiet companionship, their nights a tense vigil. Every approaching rider, every distant shout, sent a jolt of fear through Eleanor's heart. Taza, for his part, had grown even quieter, but his silence was different now. It was the watchful stillness of a hawk on a high branch, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon from the upstairs window, his body a coiled spring of readiness. He was no longer just a man healing. He was a protector, The gust of wind they dreaded arrived in the form of a lone rider. It was Captain Jonas Murdoch. He did not come with a column of soldiers this time. He came alone, which was somehow more menacing. He dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Eleanor's hands turned to ice. She sent a silent, desperate prayer that Taza would remain hidden upstairs. Murdoch entered the saloon, the afternoon sun outlining his tall frame in the doorway. He removed his hat and slapped it against his thigh, dislodging a fine layer of red dust. He did not come to the bar. Instead, he walked to the center of the empty room and turned a slow circle, his eyes taking in every detail. "It is a lonely life you lead out here, Eleanor," he said, his voice deceptively pleasant. "Too lonely for a woman like you." "I manage," she replied, her own voice tight. "What do you want?" "Jonas." He stopped his survey and fixed his cold blue eyes on her. "I found something interesting on my last patrol, out past the edge of town, near the old arroyo. A patch of disturbed earth. Looked like a grave. A fresh one." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. She kept her face a stony mask. "The desert is full of graves, Captain." "Indeed, but this one was near a set of tracks. 2 sets, actually. One made by a woman's boot. Small, practical, much like your own. The other was different. A man's print, but not a boot. A moccasin." He paused, letting the word hang in the air between them. "Now, I have been thinking, Silas, that drunken prospector, disappeared right after a storm, and my Apache fugitive, the one I am so keen to find, also vanished around the same time. A man could almost believe the 3 events are connected." He knew. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. He did not have proof, but he knew. "I do not know what you are talking about," she said, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. Murdoch's pleasant demeanor vanished, replaced by a chilling intensity. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, stopping so close she could see the flecks of silver in his blue eyes. "Do not play me for a fool. Eleanor, I have given you the benefit of the doubt. I have respected your grief, your independence, but harboring a fugitive, an enemy of the United States Army, is treason. The punishment for treason is hanging." He let that sink in before he continued, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial whisper. "But it does not have to come to that. You made a mistake, a woman's compassionate error. I can understand that, and I am willing to help you atone for it." "What do you mean?" she whispered, her throat dry. "He is still here. I can feel it." "You are hiding him." He gestured vaguely toward the ceiling. "All I need is confirmation and cooperation. You will tell me what he plans. You will let me know where he is. You will help me set a trap. In return, I will see to it that your part in this is overlooked. I will tell them you were a victim, that he forced you to help him. You will be a hero. You will be safe." He was asking her to be a spy, to betray Taza, to lead the man she loved into a noose to save her own skin. The thought was so vile it made her physically sick. "Never," she hissed, a spark of her old fire returning. His hand shot out and gripped her arm, his fingers biting into her flesh. "Think very carefully. Eleanor, this is your only chance. It is his life or yours. There is no other way out of this. You have 1 week to give me a sign that you will cooperate. 1 week, or I will return with my men, and we will tear this place apart board by board. And when we find him, I will personally see you both swing from the same gallows." He released her and strode out of the saloon, leaving her shaking in the silence, his ultimatum echoing in the empty room. That night, she could not hide her terror. Taza saw it in the tremor of her hands, the haunted look in her eyes. He sat opposite her at the small kitchen table, his presence a silent question. She told him everything, her voice a low, unsteady murmur. She described the captain, his cold eyes, his quiet threats. As she spoke, she saw a change come over Taza, His face, which had begun to soften in recent weeks, became a mask of stone. His eyes, which had started to hold a warmth meant only for her, grew distant and hard, like chips of obsidian. "This soldier," he said, his voice dangerously low. "What does he look like?" She described him: tall, fair hair, eyes the color of ice, a small, pale scar just below his left ear. Taza went utterly still. A profound and terrible silence filled the space between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow, a ghost of itself. "It is him." "Him?" Eleanor asked, confused. "What are you talking about?" "The one who gave the order, the one who watched." He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a pain so deep it seemed to have no bottom. He began to speak, not to her, but to the ghosts that had just entered the room. "It was 2 years ago. My village was not on the reservation. We were a small band, peaceful. We wanted only to be left alone. The soldiers came at dawn. They said we were harboring renegades. It was a lie. They came not for justice, but for extermination. I was away, hunting. When I returned, I saw the smoke from miles away. I heard the screams." His voice broke, and he stopped, his jaw working. He took a deep, shuddering breath before he continued. "They were killing everyone. The old ones, the children. I saw him, the officer with the ice-blue eyes. He sat on his horse, watching, as if he were watching a play. He did not raise his weapon. He did not need to. His men did the work. My wife, the woman who was to be my wife, her name was Mourning Dove. He could not finish. The words would not come." He looked down at his hands, turning them over as if he did not recognize them. "They killed our future that day. I tried to fight. It was hopeless. I was wounded, left for dead. The scar on my chest. It is from that day. I have hunted for him since. The man on the horse, the one who gave the order. It is Murdoch." Eleanor stared at him, a cold dread seeping into her bones. The conflict had just become something far darker, far more personal. This was not about a fugitive and a soldier anymore. This was about a massacre. It was about a man who had lost everything, and the monster responsible for it, who was now sleeping at a fort only a few miles away. Taza's quest for freedom had become a quest for vengeance. A cold, terrifying calm settled over Taza. The restless energy, the desire to flee, was gone. It had been replaced by a single, all-consuming purpose. He looked at Eleanor, and she saw that the man she had been teaching to write, the man who had smiled at her slap, was gone. In his place was a warrior, a hunter who had finally found the trail of his ultimate prey. Eleanor was torn. Her every instinct screamed for them to run, to disappear into the vastness of the desert where Murdoch could never find them. But she saw the look in Taza's eyes. He would not run, not anymore. To ask him to would be to ask him to deny the memory of his people, of his Mourning Dove. But to stay meant death. Murdoch's trap was closing around them. The week passed in a blur of agonizing tension. Eleanor was trapped, caught between saving the man she loved and saving his soul. She knew that if Taza killed Murdoch, the army would hunt him to the ends of the earth. He would never know a moment's peace. But if she did nothing, Murdoch would kill them both. On the last night, she made her decision. She sent a message to Murdoch, a simple, signed note delivered by a boy from town. It said only, "The canyon at midnight." Taza saw her return. "Who was that boy?" he asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. "Just a delivery from the general store." She lied, her heart twisting with guilt. But he saw the truth in her eyes. He did not press her. He simply watched her, his gaze heavy with a knowing sorrow. As midnight approached, Eleanor slipped out of the saloon. She did not know what she was going to do. Plead with Murdoch. Offer him a bribe. She only knew she had to try something, anything, to avert the coming bloodshed. She reached the mouth of the small canyon at the edge of town, the moonlight painting the rocks in shades of silver and black. Murdoch was already there, a silhouette on horseback. "You came," he said, his voice laced with triumph. "I knew you would make the sensible choice." Before she could answer, a shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows of the canyon wall. It moved with a speed that was not human. Taza. He had a knife in his hand, its blade gleaming in the moonlight. He had followed her. Murdoch saw him at the same moment. His hand flew to the pistol at his hip, but he was too slow. Taza was on him, a blur of silent, focused fury. He dragged Murdoch from his horse, and the two men crashed to the ground. It was not a fight. It was an execution. Taza was a whirlwind of motion, his body fueled by years of repressed rage. He disarmed Murdoch with brutal efficiency and had the knife to his throat before the captain could even cry out. Eleanor watched in frozen horror. This was it. Taza was about to claim his revenge. He was about to become the killer they said he was. He raised the knife, the moonlight catching the steel. His face was a mask of pure, cold hatred. "No," Eleanor screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. The spell of her horror broke, and she ran forward. She did not try to reason with him. She did not plead. She threw herself between them, grabbing Taza's arm with both hands, her fingers digging into his corded muscle. The arm was rigid, unyielding. "Taza, look at me," she cried, her face inches from his. He did not seem to see her. His eyes were fixed on the terrified face of the man beneath him. "Do not do this," she begged, her voice breaking. "Look at what you are becoming. He has already taken everything from you. Do not let his blood take the rest of the man he left inside of you." Her words, her touch, finally seemed to penetrate his wall of rage. He blinked, and for a fleeting moment, the warrior vanished. She saw the man she knew, the man whose wounds she had cleaned, whose smile she had treasured. She saw the conflict raging in his eyes, the battle between the all-consuming need for vengeance and the small, flickering flame of the man he was with her. He hesitated. It was only for a second, but it was enough. The sound of approaching hoofbeats, a patrol drawn by the commotion, broke the night's silence. Taza looked from Murdoch to Eleanor, then to the approaching riders. He made his choice. He shoved Murdoch away, grabbed Eleanor's hand, and pulled her into the darkness of the canyon, leaving his revenge bleeding on the ground behind them. They ran, hand in hand, swallowed by the shadows. Two fugitives with the entire United States Army now at their heels. The darkness of the canyon offered them a temporary reprieve, but it could not hide them forever. They ran until Eleanor's lungs burned and her legs ached. Taza's hand a firm, grounding presence in her own. They did not stop until the sounds of the pursuing soldiers had faded into the vast, indifferent silence of the desert night. They found shelter in a shallow overhang of rock, their bodies pressed together for warmth against the chill that seeped from the stone. There was no victory in their escape, only a deeper level of peril. They had not just defied Captain Jonas Murdoch, they had humiliated him. They had declared war. Eleanor knew Murdoch's pride was as vast and as barren as the landscape around them. He would not let this go. He would twist the truth, paint her as a willing accomplice, a traitor to her own kind. Her life in Red Mesa, the small world she had so carefully maintained, was over. The dusty spur, her home and her fortress, was lost to them. They were truly fugitives now, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a future as uncertain as the shifting sands. Sleep did not come. They sat in a tense, shared silence, listening. With the first pale light of dawn, Taza was on his feet, his body taut. From a high vantage point, he watched the town. Eleanor waited below, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. When he returned, his face was grim. "He has the town," Taza said, his voice low. "Soldiers are everywhere. At your saloon, at the stables. They are watching every road." They had not escaped. They had only been cornered. The fury of Jonas Murdoch descended upon Red Mesa with the full force of military law. He had returned to the fort, his face a mask of cold rage, and declared Eleanor Hayes a conspirator and a traitor. He used her note, the one summoning him to the canyon, as undeniable proof of her collusion. He painted a picture of a cunning woman who had lured him into an ambush, a woman who had willingly harbored the savage who killed one of his officers. By mid-morning, he rode back into town not as a search party, but as an occupying force. Sheriff Miller, a man accustomed to settling disputes over cards and cattle, was hopelessly out of his depth. He stood on the porch of his small office and watched as Murdoch's soldiers stormed the dusty spur. They smashed the door, overturned tables, and shattered bottles of whiskey, their destruction a violent expression of their captain's rage. They found her living quarters, the small, neat room that still held the faint scent of her perfume, and they tore it apart. Murdoch's real target, however, was Eleanor herself. He knew Taza would not abandon her. She was the bait, and he would set the trap in the most public, most brutal way imaginable. He had his men drag the heavy timbers of the blacksmith's workshop into the center of the street. Under the harsh glare of the midday sun, they began to construct a gallows. The sound of their hammers echoed through the town, each blow a nail in Eleanor's coffin. The townspeople watched, their faces a mixture of fear and a grim, self-preserving curiosity. There was no one to speak for her. The bounty on Taza's head had been doubled, and a new reward was offered for any information leading to the capture of the traitor. Eleanor Hayes. Fear and greed were a powerful combination. Friends became strangers, and neighbors looked away. Taza saw it all from the rocks above. He watched as they built the scaffold, a knot of ice forming in his gut. He saw the cold satisfaction on Murdoch's face. This was his fault. He had brought this destruction upon her. His quest for vengeance had cost her everything. The guilt was a physical weight, heavier than any stone. He had to save her. But a direct assault was suicide. He was one man against 24 armed soldiers. He needed a plan. He needed a diversion. He needed fire. For 2 days, they remained hidden, the noose of Murdoch's patrol tightening around the base of the mesas. Eleanor, weak from lack of food and water, fell into a fitful, exhausted sleep. Taza used the time to move like a ghost through the canyons he knew so well. He gathered what he needed: dry brush, a small piece of flint, and a desperate, razor-sharp strategy. On the 3rd day, Murdoch's soldiers found her. She had moved to a small spring to refill their canteens when they came upon her. There was no fight left in her. She was exhausted, starved, and heartbroken. They dragged her back to Red Mesa, her hands bound in front of her. They threw her not in a cell, but in the storeroom of her own saloon, the same room where she had saved Taza's life. The execution was set for sunset. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, the soldiers dragged her out into the street. They forced her to stand on the rough wooden platform, the rope a coarse, menacing presence against the side of her neck. The entire town was there to watch. Jonas Murdoch stood at the base of the gallows, his arms crossed, his face a mask of triumphant righteousness. He looked up at her, his voice carrying in the tense silence. "Let this be a lesson," he declared. "This is the fate of all who conspire with our enemies. This is the price of treason." From his perch high in the rocks, Taza watched. His heart felt as if it were being squeezed in a vice. He took a slow, steadying breath, the scent of dust and dry pine needles filling his lungs. He had set his own trap. A large pile of tinder-dry brush and dead wood was piled at the narrow, windy mouth of the canyon that served as the main entrance to the town. He waited until the last possible moment, until the hangman was adjusting the knot of the rope. Then he struck the flint. A spark caught, and a small flame licked at the dry kindling. The wind did the rest. It whipped the small flame into a hungry blaze, and in seconds, a wall of fire and thick, choking smoke roared across the canyon entrance, cutting off the town. Panic erupted. The soldiers, seeing their only route of escape consumed by flames, shouted in alarm. Horses screamed and reared, their eyes wide with terror. Murdoch, his perfect execution shattered, began yelling orders, his voice lost in the chaos. He sent half his men to fight the fire, a futile gesture against the wind-driven inferno. In that moment of confusion, Taza moved. He had circled around, using a series of hidden ledges, and now descended into the town from behind the saloon. He carried a rifle he had taken from a lone patrolman 2 days prior. He moved not like a man, but like a shadow, silent and swift. The soldiers left to guard the gallows were distracted, their attention torn between the prisoner and the raging fire. Taza fired once. A guard on the platform crumpled, his rifle clattering on the wood. The second shot took down another man near the base. The chaos intensified. Murdoch, realizing the fire was a diversion, spun around, drawing his pistol, his face contorted in a snarl of pure hatred. Taza was already moving, firing as he ran. He did not aim to kill Murdoch. Not yet. He aimed to free Eleanor. A bullet tore through the thick rope holding the gallows trapdoor, and a second shattered the arm of the hangman. Taza reached the platform, cutting the rope from Eleanor's neck with a slash of his knife. He pulled her close, his arm a band of steel around her waist. "Come," he said, his voice urgent. Gunfire erupted all around them. The canyon had become a shooting gallery, the ricochet of bullets whining off the rock faces. Smoke from the fire and the dust kicked up by running feet filled the air, creating a swirling, hellish twilight. They scrambled from the platform, using the chaos as their cover. A searing pain shot through Eleanor's side. She cried out, stumbling. She looked down and saw a dark stain spreading across the fabric of her dress. One of Murdoch's wild shots had found its mark. Taza saw her falter. He did not hesitate. He swept her up into his arms, her head falling against his shoulder. He ignored the burning in his own lungs, the protest of his muscles. He ran, carrying her away from the sounds of the battle, deeper into the maze of rock and shadow. Bullets whizzed past them, but his knowledge of the terrain was their only shield. He found a narrow crevice, a crack in the rock face almost invisible in the gloom, and slipped inside. He followed the winding passage until it opened into a small, dark cave, no bigger than a closet. The sounds of the gunfight were muffled here, distant and dreamlike. He gently laid Eleanor down on the cool stone floor. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow and ragged. He tore a strip from his shirt and pressed it against the wound in her side, his touch firm but gentle. Her blood was hot against his fingers. He looked into her eyes, and what he saw there broke his heart. It was not fear, it was a profound, heartbreaking sorrow. Her breath hitched, and she reached up, her hand trembling as she touched his cheek. Her voice was a bare whisper, each word an effort. "If there is a next life, Taza," she said, her eyes searching his, "I will not tremble when I touch you." A wave of emotion so powerful it threatened to drown him washed over Taza. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. His own voice was thick with a pain that went deeper than any wound. "We do not need a next life. Eleanor," he whispered fiercely, "I am here." He captured her hand, the one that had once slapped him in trembling despair, and brought it to his lips. He held it there, feeling the faint, fragile beat of her pulse against his skin, in the dark of the cave, with the sounds of a dying battle outside and the metallic scent of her blood in the air. He held on to her, a silent, desperate promise in the face of death. They stayed in the cave until the last embers of the fire Taza had set had died, and the sounds of Murdoch's disorganized retreat echoed up the canyon. The wound in Eleanor's side was a constant, throbbing pain, a fiery reminder of how close she had come to death. Taza had cleaned it as best he could with precious water from their canteen and bound it tightly. He had found a desert plant with broad, fleshy leaves, crushed them between 2 stones to make a poultice, and applied it to the wound. The strange, earthy-smelling paste had a cooling effect, and for that, she was grateful. They could not stay. Their escape had been a miracle born of fire and chaos, but Murdoch was not a man to be deterred. He was a hunter, and his prey had now wounded his pride as well as his person. He would scour the territory with a relentless fury. Red Mesa was a memory, a ghost town in Eleanor's past. Their only hope lay north, across the vast, punishing emptiness of the Mojave. Taza spoke of freer lands, territories where the reach of the army was less certain, where a man and a woman might disappear if they were clever and lucky. Luck, Eleanor thought, felt like a foreign country. Before they could run, they needed horses and supplies. It was a suicidal risk, but a necessary one. As the false dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of gray and lavender, Taza slipped from the cave. "Stay here. Do not move. Do not make a sound," he commanded, his voice a low whisper. He moved with a supernatural silence, melting into the landscape, and was gone. Eleanor was left alone with the pain and the silence. The silence was worse. It was a hollow, ringing void that her mind filled with the sound of gunshots, of Murdoch's voice, of the sickening snap of a gallows trap door. She had been a saloon owner, a woman of property and standing, however small. Now she was a wounded fugitive in a torn dress, hiding in a hole in the ground. The woman she had been felt like a stranger from another life. What felt like an eternity later, Taza returned. He led 2 horses, saddled and ready. They were her horses, from her own stable. Slung across one of the saddles were saddlebags bulging with supplies, and 2 canteens, full. He had risked everything to go back. The town was in chaos, he explained as he helped her into the saddle, his hands gentle as he eased her wounded body onto the leather. "The fire is out, but Murdoch has lost control. His men are frightened. They think the whole Apache nation is hiding in the hills. They are looking for ghosts." They rode north, away from the rising sun, their long shadows stretching out before them like roads to nowhere. The first days were a blur of pain for Eleanor. Every jolt of the horse was a fresh agony in her side. Taza set a relentless pace, pushing the horses and themselves to the limits of their endurance. He was a different man in the wild, in the confines of the saloon. He had been a caged animal. Out here, he was the master of his domain. He read the land like a book, finding hidden springs where there seemed to be only dry rock, and leading them through twisting canyons that left no trail. He cared for her with a quiet, efficient tenderness. He changed her dressing each night, his touch surprisingly gentle. He hunted, bringing back a brace of quail or a rabbit that he would cook over a tiny, smokeless fire. He would give her the best portions, the most water, his own needs secondary to hers. He rarely spoke, but his actions were a language she was beginning to understand. It was a language of survival, of protection, of a loyalty that ran deeper than words. As her wound began to heal, a slow, knitting ache replacing the sharp, searing pain, Eleanor began to change. The helplessness she had felt in the cave began to curdle into a quiet determination. She had survived a hanging. She had survived a gunshot. She would not be a burden. She would not be the weakness that got them both killed. One evening, as Taza cleaned the rifle he had taken, she watched him, her gaze intense. "You must teach me," she said. He looked up, his dark eyes questioning. "To use that," she said, nodding at the rifle, "and the pistol you took from the guard. I will not be helpless." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. The next day, he began her lessons. He handed her the pistol first. It was heavy in her hand, a cold, alien weight, the weight of death. He showed her how to load it, how to aim, how to squeeze the trigger without flinching. Her first shot was deafeningly loud, kicking her arm back and sending a puff of dust into the air a good 10 feet wide of the rock he had told her to aim for. But she did not drop the gun. She gritted her teeth, aimed again, and fired. The second shot struck the rock with a satisfying chip. She learned to hunt, not just to shoot. Taza taught her how to set a snare, how to read the tracks of small game, how to move with a silence that did not disturb the world around her. The first time she caught a rabbit in one of her own snares, she felt a surge of fierce, primitive pride. She had provided. She had taken from the land what they needed to survive. The woman who had once measured her days by the number of whiskey barrels in her storeroom now measured them by the weight of a rabbit in her hand and the number of cartridges in her belt. The desert was a relentless teacher. They faced a sandstorm that blew for a day and a night, a churning world of grit and wind that forced them to huddle behind a rock outcropping, their bodies covered in a shared blanket, the horses shivering beside them. They ran low on water, their throats parched, their lips cracked, until Taza found a series of deep, stone cisterns where the rainwater had collected, a miracle of green algae and life in the middle of a sun-baked wasteland. They encountered other people, specters in the vast emptiness. Once, they saw a wagon in the distance, a family of settlers, their faces worn and weary, their dreams drying up under the relentless sun. Eleanor felt a pang of her old life, a desire to offer them a cool drink, a safe place to rest. But Taza put a hand on her arm, his eyes watchful. "We are the ghosts now," he said. "They would see you and see a captive. They would see me and see a killer. They would see the bounty." So they watched from a distance as the wagon crawled across the horizon, two separate worlds passing in silence. Another time, the danger was more direct. Two riders, their faces hard and their eyes greedy, shadowed them for the better part of a day. They were not soldiers. They were scavengers, men who preyed on the weak. Eleanor felt the cold knot of fear in her stomach. But this time, it was different. It was a cold, clear fear, not a panicked one. That evening, Taza led them into a narrow box canyon. The riders followed, confident they had trapped their quarry. But Taza had them climb a hidden trail up the canyon wall. From their high perch, they watched as the two men entered the empty canyon below. Taza sent a single rifle shot echoing through the canyon, the bullet striking the rock just above their heads. The message was clear. The two men, realizing they had ridden into a prepared ambush, turned and fled. Taza had not needed to kill them. He had outthought them, and Eleanor, lying beside him on the rock ledge, the pistol firm in her hand, had been ready. She was his partner, not his ward. In watching her change, Taza began to change as well. The hard, cold knot of vengeance in his heart began to loosen. His focus shifted from the past to the present, from what he had lost to what he had to protect. He saw in Eleanor a spirit that was as resilient and as unyielding as the desert itself. She had not been broken by her loss, or by his war. She had been forged anew. He found himself watching her as she practiced with the pistol, or as she carefully skinned a rabbit for their dinner, and a feeling he had thought long dead stirred within him. It was a quiet admiration that warmed into a deep, abiding affection. One evening, after she had successfully tracked and shot a quail for their meal, a feat that would have been unimaginable weeks before, she looked up to find him watching her. A slow smile spread across his face. It was the first genuine, unguarded smile she had ever seen from him. It reached his eyes, crinkling the corners and chasing away the shadows. The sight of it was more beautiful than any sunset, more precious than any desert spring. That night, they sat by a small fire, the silence between them comfortable now, not tense. They had only a small piece of hard, dry bread left from the supplies Taza had taken. He broke it in two and handed her a piece. The simple act felt like a sacrament. "This saloon of yours?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Was it a good home?" Eleanor looked into the flames. "It was a good business. It was a roof and 4 walls. After my Samuel died, it was a place to be. But a home, I am not sure I have had a home since I was a girl. A home is a place you feel safe, I think, where you belong. The saloon was just a place I defended." Taza nodded, understanding. "My home was not a building. he said, his gaze distant. It was the sound of my people laughing. It was the smell of piñon smoke on a cold morning. It was the face of mourning dove. When the soldiers burned it, they burned more than our lodges. They burned our world. They were silent for a long time, the fire crackling, the stars a cold, brilliant canopy above them. Maybe a home is not a place at all, Eleanor said softly, more to herself than to him. Taza looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. He looked at her determined face, smudged with dirt and lit by the flickering flames. He looked at the vast, lonely desert that surrounded them. And then he looked at their two hands, resting near each other on the warm sand between them. "No," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Maybe it is not." They had traveled for weeks, and the character of the land had begun to change. The scorched, open flats of the deep desert were giving way to a more broken country of twisted canyons, weathered bluffs, and stubborn, hardy piñon pines. They were close to the northern edge of the Mojave, a few days' ride from the territories where the law was a more fluid concept. A fragile sense of hope had begun to take root in Eleanor's heart. They had survived. They had become a unit, two halves of a whole, speaking a language of shared glances and quiet understanding. The future was still a blank map, but for the first time, it did not feel like a threat. It felt like a possibility. The feeling was an illusion. The desert does not give up its ghosts so easily. It began with a feeling, a prickling on the back of Taza's neck, a subtle shift in the wind that carried no scent, but a feeling of wrongness. He had reined in his horse, his head cocked, his body utterly still as he scanned the high, rocky ridges that hemmed them in. Eleanor stopped beside him, her hand instinctively resting on the pistol at her hip. "What is it?" she whispered. He did not answer immediately. His eyes, narrowed to slits, traced the line of the bluffs. "I do not know. Something—" The world seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the buzz of a lone fly and the soft stamp of a horse's hoof. Then, from a high ridge to their right, came a flash of reflected sunlight, a tiny, brilliant star that winked and disappeared. It was their only warning. The crack of the rifle was a flat, brutal sound that shattered the silence. It was followed an instant later by a grunt of pain from Taza. He stiffened in the saddle, his back arching, and then he was falling, a slow, terrible topple to the red earth. Eleanor screamed his name, a raw, ragged sound torn from her throat. She leaped from her horse and ran to him. He lay on his side, his face contorted in a mask of agony. A dark, wet patch was spreading rapidly across his left shoulder, staining the buckskin a deep crimson. Before she could even process the horror, more figures appeared on the ridge. Not the blue of cavalry uniforms. These were men in dusty, mismatched civilian clothes, their faces hard and bearded, their movements predatory. They carried rifles with a casual, deadly competence. And then a single figure stepped forward, his form outlined against the bright sky. Even at this distance, Eleanor recognized the arrogant posture, the cruel set of his shoulders. Jonas Murdoch. He had not come with soldiers. He had come with hired guns, mercenaries, men who killed for coin, unburdened by rules of engagement or military procedure. "Well, Eleanor," his voice boomed across the canyon, amplified by the rock walls. "It seems your journey has come to an end, a fitting place for it. Do you not think so much dust and stone? It will make a fine grave." Gunfire erupted from the ridge, kicking up puffs of dirt around them. The horses, terrified, bolted. Taza, his face pale, pushed himself up with his good arm. He shoved the rifle into her hands. "Go!" he gasped, his voice strained with pain. "Take the rocks! Run!" "No," she said, her voice shaking. "I will not leave you. There is no choice. They will kill us both. Go, live." "Eleanor, that is an order." He tried to give her a push, his strength already failing. The mercenaries were beginning to make their way down the treacherous slope, their movements sure-footed and menacing. They were taking their time, savoring the kill. This was a hunt, and they had cornered their prey. For a split second, Eleanor was paralyzed. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at her to obey Taza, to flee into the labyrinth of rocks where she might have a chance to disappear. The woman she used to be, the frightened widow, would have run without a second thought. But that woman was gone. She had been burned away in the desert, in the fire of the canyon, in the quiet moments of shared survival. To run now would be to abandon the only home she had ever truly known. She looked at Taza's face, at the pain and the desperate plea in his eyes, and she made her choice. "All right," she said, her voice suddenly calm and clear. She took the rifle. She leaned down and kissed his forehead, a brief, fierce press of her lips against his skin. Then she turned and ran, not away, but along the base of the canyon wall, disappearing into a narrow fissure between two massive boulders. Murdoch laughed from his perch above, a harsh, triumphant sound. "That is right. Run, little rabbit. There is nowhere to hide." He and two of his men made their way down to the canyon floor to claim their prize, while the others remained on the ridge, their rifles ready. But Eleanor was not running. She was hunting. She moved through the rocks with a speed and silence Taza had taught her, her heart a cold, steady drum against her ribs. Her fear was a whetstone, sharpening her senses, making the world seem preternaturally clear. She circled around, climbing, her boots finding purchase on the rough stone. She remembered the lessons. Use the terrain. Do not present a target. Make every shot count. She found her spot, a small, sheltered ledge 100 yards from where Taza lay, offering her a clear view of the scene below. Murdoch and his men had reached him. They kicked his rifle away and hauled him to his feet. He sagged between them, his left arm hanging uselessly, his face a stoic mask that betrayed nothing. Murdoch stood before him, his face flushed with victory. He backhanded Taza across the face, a sharp, cracking blow. "You have cost me a great deal. Savage!" He spat. "My reputation, my time. Now, you will pay for it." He nodded to one of his men. "String him up. We will finish this properly." The man holstered his pistol and uncoiled a rope from his saddle. He was going to hang him, right there, from the branch of a skeletal, dead tree. He was going to make Taza suffer the same fate he had intended for Eleanor. Eleanor rested the rifle on the rock ledge, just as Taza had shown her. She took a slow, deep breath, letting it out gently. She lined up the sight on the chest of the man with the rope. He was laughing, making a crude joke to his companion. She felt no hesitation. She felt nothing but a cold, clear purpose. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The report of the shot was clean and sharp. The man with the rope jerked as if struck by lightning. A look of profound surprise crossed his face. He dropped the rope and pitched forward into the dust, a dark stain blossoming on the back of his shirt. For a stunned moment, there was absolute silence. Then chaos erupted. The second mercenary spun around, his pistol out, firing wildly in her direction. Murdoch shoved Taza to the ground and scrambled for the cover of a boulder, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. Eleanor worked the rifle's action, ejecting the spent cartridge, chambering a new round. She fired again, the bullet smacking into the rock near the second man's head, sending stone chips flying. He yelped and dove for cover. Down on the canyon floor, Taza was not idle, despite the blinding pain in his shoulder. He had rolled and drawn his pistol with his right hand. As the second mercenary was distracted by Eleanor's shots, Taza fired. His aim was true. The man cried out and fell, clutching a leg. Now it was only Murdoch. He was pinned behind his rock, firing his pistol blindly up at Eleanor's position. "She is mine!" he screamed, his voice cracking with fury. "The bounty is mine." Eleanor kept firing, her shots carefully placed, keeping him pinned down. She was not trying to kill him. Not yet. This fight belonged to Taza. Slowly, painfully. Taza got to his feet. He held his pistol in his good hand, his wounded arm held tight against his body. He began to walk toward the boulder where Murdoch was hiding, his steps unsteady but deliberate. "Come out, Murdoch," Taza called, his voice strained but carrying a weight of finality. "This is between you and me." Murdoch, seeing Taza exposed, leaned out from behind the rock, his pistol leveled. But before he could fire, a shot from Eleanor's rifle struck the rock just beside his head, forcing him back. He was trapped between them. With a roar of frustration, Murdoch stood up, his pistol held in both hands, ready to end it. He and Taza faced each other across 20 yards of sun-blasted earth, the two wounded mercenaries forgotten. Here, at last, was the confrontation Taza had sought for 2 long years. Here was the man who had haunted his every waking moment, the ghost who had stolen his past and his future. "Your people were weak," Murdoch sneered, his face a twisted mask of hatred. "You are a dying race. I was merely expediting the process." Taza said nothing. His face was a chiseled ruin of grief and rage. He raised his pistol, his hand surprisingly steady. All the pain, all the loss, all the miles he had traveled, had led to this single defining moment of vengeance. Eleanor watched from her perch, her rifle held ready. She saw the look on Taza's face. It was the same look he had worn in the canyon at Red Mesa, the look of a man about to be consumed by the ghost he was hunting. She remembered her own words, "Do not let his blood take the rest of the man he left inside of you." Murdoch raised his own weapon, a smirk on his lips. He was going to fire. Taza was going to fire. 2 men, bound by hatred, about to destroy each other. A single gunshot echoed through the canyon. Jonas Murdoch stiffened. His eyes went wide, not with pain, but with a look of pure, final surprise. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of his chest. His pistol fell from his nerveless fingers. He stood for a long moment, a statue of a man, and then he crumpled to the ground, his face landing in the red dust he had sought to conquer. Taza stood frozen, his own pistol still raised, a curl of smoke drifting from its barrel. Though he had not fired, he slowly lowered his arm and turned his head. Eleanor was standing on the canyon floor, not far from him. She had left her rifle on the ledge and made her way down. She held the pistol in her hand, its barrel still pointed at the spot where Murdoch had stood. Her face was pale, but her hand was steady. Her expression was not one of triumph or of hatred. It was one of profound, quiet sorrow. She had made her choice. She had seen the abyss of vengeance opening up to swallow the man she loved, and she had stepped in front of it. Justice did not always come from the hand of the wronged. Sometimes, it came from the heart of a woman who had already lost too much to stand by and lose everything that was left. She had not killed Murdoch for Taza's past. She had killed him for their future, a future she would not allow to be built on a foundation of blood and ghosts. Taza looked at her, at the smoking pistol in her hand, and in his eyes, there was no surprise. There was only a vast, aching, and profound understanding. She had saved him again. Not from a bullet, but from himself. The hunt was over. The price of their freedom had been paid, and in the ringing silence of the canyon, they were, at last, truly free. They did not bury the dead. They left them where they had fallen, 3 broken shapes in the red dust, a final offering to the vast, indifferent silence of the canyon. The scavengers and the sun would be their undertakers. It was not an act of cruelty, but one of finality. They were turning their backs on the world of men and their violent reckonings. They took what they needed from the mercenaries, supplies, ammunition, a sack of dried beans, a small bag of salt, and a 3rd horse. Taza's wounded shoulder was a constant, throbbing agony, and Eleanor's side still sent sharp protests with every jolt. but they rode as if the ghosts of the men they had killed were at their heels. They did not ride north. The north was a promise that had been broken, a direction tainted by Murdoch's pursuit. Instead, they turned south, toward the jagged, sun-bleached mountains that marked the borderlands. A lawless, forgotten country that belonged to no one and everyone. It was a land of sharp rock and deep shadow, a place where a man could disappear if he knew the secret ways. Taza knew them. He led them on a winding, difficult path, through dry washes and over high, wind-scoured mesas, a journey that erased their trail and their past with every mile. After many weeks of travel, when their bodies were lean and hard and their faces were burned brown by the sun, they found it. It was a small, hidden valley, cradled in a crescent of high, impassable mountains. A clear, cold spring bubbled up from a fissure in the rock, feeding a creek that snaked through a patch of green grass and a stand of ancient cottonwood trees. The valley was a secret, a pocket of impossible life in the middle of the harsh, dry landscape. It was a place to stop running. Here, they began to build a life from the materials of the earth. Taza, his shoulder slowly healing, showed Eleanor how to make bricks from the rich adobe clay near the creek bed, mixing it with grass and water and leaving them to bake in the sun. They built a small, simple dwelling against the sheltering wall of the canyon. It had one room, a packed earth floor, and a roof made of cottonwood branches sealed with mud. It was not the sturdy, timbered saloon she had known, but as Eleanor smoothed the last layer of adobe on the wall with her bare hands, she felt a sense of ownership, of creation, she had never felt before. This was not a place she had inherited or purchased. This was a place she had made. The seasons turned. The fierce heat of summer softened into the crisp, golden light of autumn. The raw, desperate urgency of their flight faded, replaced by the steady, quiet rhythm of daily existence. They were no longer fugitives. They were inhabitants. Taza's wounds healed, leaving behind new scars to join the old ones, maps of the life he had survived. The haunted look in his eyes, the constant, watchful tension in his body, began to recede. He started to sleep through the night without the violent, thrashing nightmares of the massacre. Eleanor's own wound healed to a thin, pale line on her side, a permanent reminder of the price of their freedom. The hard shell of the woman she had become on the trail softened, not into weakness, but into a quiet, resilient strength. They were not alone for long. The world is smaller than a map would have you believe, and the borderlands were a gathering place for the lost and the broken. A family appeared one day, a man and a woman and their two small children, their face thin with hunger, their eyes wide with fear. They were Apache, survivors of a cavalry raid on their small settlement further east. They had heard whispers of a hidden valley, a safe place. Taza welcomed them, sharing the rabbits he had caught, speaking to them in the soft, guttural language of his people. A few weeks later, another family arrived, and then an old man leading a single, lame horse. Slowly, a small community of ghosts began to assemble in their silent land. They were the remnants of a shattered people, the last survivors of a war they had already lost. In their eyes, Taza saw the same loss, the same deep, aching sorrow that he carried in his own heart. And in them, he found a new purpose that had nothing to do with vengeance. He began to teach the children. He took the two small boys and a young girl, who was all that was left of her family, and led them into the canyons. He taught them the skills that had kept him alive. He showed them how to track a deer, how to read the clouds for signs of rain, how to find water in the roots of a plant. He taught them which snakes were deadly and which plants were medicine. But he taught them more than that. He taught them the stories of their people, the names of the mountain spirits, the songs that were sung to the rising sun. He was no longer just a warrior. He was a memory keeper, a bridge to a world that was vanishing. Eleanor would watch him with the children, his voice low and patient, and see a gentleness in him she had only glimpsed before. He was breathing life back into the embers of a dying fire. Eleanor, too, found a new role. These people, these survivors, looked at her with a mixture of fear and awe. She was the white woman who belonged to Taza, the warrior who had appeared in their valley like a spirit. They did not understand her, but they saw that he trusted her, and so they kept a respectful distance. She saw the children, their minds bright and curious, and she knew that the world outside this valley, the world that had destroyed their families, was a world of written words, of treaties they could not read, of laws designed to trap them. One afternoon, she gathered the children. She took a piece of charcoal and a flat, smooth piece of bark. "I will teach you the white man's marks," she said, her voice soft. Taza had translated her offer, his expression neutral. The children looked at her with suspicion. Taza spoke to them, his tone low and earnest. "This is not their magic," he told them. "It is a tool, like a knife. It can be used to harm, or it can be used to carve a new life. You must learn to use all the tools that this new world provides." And so she began to teach. She drew the letter A and told them it was the sound of the hawk, the as it soared on the wind. She drew B and told them it was the buzz of the bee. She made it a game, connecting the strange, foreign symbols to the world they knew. The children were quick learners, their minds hungry for this new knowledge. In the evenings, they would scratch the letters in the dirt with sticks, their brows furrowed in concentration. She was giving them a shield, a weapon for a future she could only imagine. Their small, self-contained world was peaceful, but it was not paradise. It was a life of hard work, of constant vigilance. And the outside world, the world that had cast them out, still existed just beyond the mountain peaks. One day, a prospector, his mule laden with supplies, stumbled into their valley, following the creek in a desperate search for water. He was a grizzled old man with watery blue eyes and a beard stained with tobacco. He stopped dead when he saw the small settlement, his hand hovering near the pistol at his belt. He saw the Apache women tending a small garden of corn and squash. He saw the children playing a game with stones, and then he saw Eleanor, her auburn hair braided down her back, her skin tanned from the sun, as she emerged from her small adobe house. His eyes widened, first in disbelief, and then in a kind of knowing contempt. He had heard the stories that had drifted down from the north, stories of a renegade Apache warrior and the white woman who ran with him. He watered his mule and filled his canteens. His movements hurried. He would not meet Eleanor's gaze. Taza stood at a distance, his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask of stone. The prospector did not linger. He mounted his mule and left the valley, casting a last, long look over his shoulder, a look that branded Eleanor for what she was in his eyes, a woman who had crossed a line, who had chosen the wrong side, the Indian woman. He took their story with him, and it became a legend in the border towns and mining camps. They spoke of the Apache warrior who had given up the fight, the man who lived in peace while his people were being herded onto reservations. He was a traitor to the war, a man who had gone soft. They spoke of the red-headed woman who lived with him, a captive. Some said bewitched, said others, but all agreed she was an outcast, a woman who had abandoned her own kind. The labels did not wound them. They had already paid the price for their freedom in blood and fear. The judgment of a world they had left behind was nothing more than the whisper of a distant wind. They did not feel resentment. Resentment was a poison, and this valley was a place of healing. They had found something more valuable than acceptance. They had found a life that had meaning, a life built on the quiet, steady work of survival and creation. They lived each day as it came. They found joy in the small, simple things, the taste of the first sweet corn from their garden, the feel of the cool creek water on a hot day, the sound of the children laughing. In the evenings, they would sit outside their small home and watch the sky bleed into a tapestry of purple and rose. They rarely spoke of the past, of Red Mesa, of Jonas Murdoch. The ghosts were still there, but they no longer had the power to haunt them. They had been laid to rest in the silent land. a place where a white woman and an Apache warrior had built a home, not on a piece of ground, but in the quiet, shared space of each other's heart. The years fell away like grains of sand in a slow, steady hourglass. In the hidden valley, a generation was born and came of age in peace. The small band of survivors grew into a quiet, self-sufficient community, their lives governed by the sun and the seasons, not by the calendars or the laws of the world beyond the mountain peaks. The children Eleanor and Taza had taught were now men and women with children of their own. They could track a deer for 3 days and read a page from a tattered book with equal skill. They were a new kind of people, born of 2 worlds, at home in a land that was no longer a battlefield. Time etched its passage onto Eleanor and Taza as it did the rock of the canyon walls. The fiery red of her hair was softened by strands of silver that shone like captured moonlight. The lines around her eyes were deeper now, crinkled from decades of squinting into the bright sun and from the quiet smiles she shared with Taza. She was no longer the saloon keeper, nor the desperate fugitive. She was the matriarch of their small, forgotten tribe, a woman whose calm presence was the steady, beating heart of their community. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused and capable, as skilled at grinding corn as they were at stitching a wound. Taza had aged like a great pine, his lean frame growing more gnarled, his strength settling deep into his bones. The warrior's fire in his eyes had not been extinguished, but it had banked into a warm, steady glow of wisdom. The ghosts that had haunted him for so long had finally been laid to rest, not through vengeance, but through the patient, daily work of building a future. He was the teacher, the elder, the living memory of a world that had vanished. His face was a landscape of its own, a map of all the trails he had walked, all the sorrows he had endured, and all the peace he had finally found. Their love had deepened and changed, transforming from a desperate, clinging vine into the deep, intertwined roots of 2 ancient trees. Words were often unnecessary. A shared glance across the small plaza they had built, a light touch of his hand on her arm as they walked by the creek, a comfortable silence as they sat watching the stars appear in the vast, velvet sky. These were the language of their life together. They had forged a home not just in the valley, but in each other. Beyond the mountains, their story had passed into folklore, in dusty saloons and around lonely campfires. Men who had never met them spoke their names. The tale grew with each telling. They were no longer just a man and a woman, but figures of myth. They spoke of the Apache warrior, Taza, a spirit of vengeance who had been tamed by the love of a white woman. They spoke of the red woman of the canyon, Eleanor, some saying she was a sorceress who had bewitched him, others that she was a saint who had saved his soul. They became a symbol of the wild, untamable heart of the West itself, a testament to a love that had refused to recognize the boundaries of race or the edicts of law. Their legend was a wild seed that had taken root in the hard soil of the frontier, a story that belonged to everyone now. For more than 20 years, they lived in their silent land, but the desert that had given them sanctuary is a land of endings as well as beginnings. Eleanor, who had survived a rope and a bullet, could not survive the slow, patient assault of time. It began as a cough, a dry rattle in her chest that would not leave. At first, she dismissed it, but the cough lingered and then deepened. A weariness settled into her bones, a fatigue that no amount of sleep could banish. Her steps grew slower, her breath shorter. Taza watched her, his face a mask of quiet dread. He knew the signs. It was a sickness of the lungs, a slow fire that consumed from within. He brought her special teas made from herbs he gathered high in the mountains. He sat with her for hours, holding her hand, his presence a silent, desperate plea to the spirits of the land to spare her. She knew she was dying. There was no fear in her, only a great, gentle sadness. Her life had been a storm, and now a deep and final calm was settling over her. One evening, as they sat outside their home watching the sunset, She leaned her head against his shoulder. His arm, still strong, came around her. "Did we do the right thing?" "Taza," she whispered, her voice thin as a dry leaf. He was silent for a long time, watching the last sliver of the sun disappear behind the western peaks. "We lived." "Eleanor," he said finally, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "We truly lived." And in that simple statement, she found her answer. It was all the absolution she needed. Her last days were peaceful. The people of the valley, the children and grandchildren of the first survivors, would come and sit quietly outside her door. A silent vigil of love and respect. Taza never left her side. It was a final, poignant reversal of their first meeting. Now, he was the caregiver, tending to her, spooning broth into her mouth, wiping her brow with a cool, damp cloth. She died in the deep stillness of the pre-dawn, in the small adobe house they had built together. Her last breath was a quiet sigh, a gentle release. Taza held her in his arms as she grew still, his cheek resting against her silver hair. The silence she left behind was more profound, more absolute, than the silence of the desert itself. He sat with her until the sun rose, its first rays illuminating the dust motes dancing in the quiet room. Then, with a slow, deliberate tenderness, he began his final duty to her. He washed her body and dressed her in her best dress, a simple calico she had sewn herself. He wrapped her in the finest blanket they owned, a soft, woolen blanket woven with the colors of the sunset. He carried her out of the house, out of the valley. The people watched him go, their face etched with a silent, communal grief. They understood this was a journey he had to make alone. He placed her body gently across the saddle of her horse. He did not ride. He walked, leading the horse, his own horse trailing behind. He walked out of the green sanctuary of their hidden valley and back into the harsh, beautiful, and unforgiving world of the desert where their story had truly begun. He walked for a day and a night, his face set like stone, his heart a hollow place in his chest. He was looking for a specific spot, a place he had seen once, long ago. He found it on the second morning. It was a vast, open plain, a sea of red sand and rock that stretched to the horizon. And in the very center of that great emptiness stood a single, ancient juniper tree. It was a miracle of survival, its branches twisted and sculpted by 1,000 years of wind, its roots driven deep into the rock to find some hidden source of life. Here, beneath the shade of the lone survivor, he dug her grave. He worked through the heat of the day, his grief a silent, driving engine. When the grave was deep enough, he lowered her into the earth. He found a large, flat piece of red sandstone, the color of a bleeding heart. He took his knife, the same knife that had cut her free from the gallows, and he began to carve. His hands were not made for such delicate work. The letters he formed were rough, uneven, and deeply cut. It took him hours. Each stroke was a memory, each carved line a testament to the life they had shared. When he was finished, he set the stone at the head of the grave. The sun, low in the western sky, illuminated the words he had carved. She found her heart where the desert bled red. He stood there for a long time as the sun set, the sky turning the color of his own sorrow. He had fulfilled his promise. He had brought her to her final home. He had given her a name and a story that would be forever etched in the stone of the land they had both loved. When the last light had faded and the first stars appeared, he turned away from the grave. He did not look back. He released the horses, slapping their rumps and sending them galloping off into the darkness. They were free, as he now was. He faced the vast, open desert. He was a man with no home, no destination, and no past left to haunt him. He was a part of the landscape again, a solitary figure in the immense silence. He began to walk, his footsteps making no sound on the soft sand. He walked until his form became a faint smudge in the moonlight. And then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness and the distance, disappearing as completely and as silently as the wind. The new century arrived on wheels of steel and in a cloud of coal smoke. The year was 1910, and the Wild West was dead. It had been tamed, fenced, and divided. Its vast silences broken by the clang of the telegraph and the whistle of the locomotive. Its legends, however, were more stubborn than the land itself. They survived in the memories of old men, in the tall tales told to wide-eyed children, in the half-forgotten names of lonely canyons and dry riverbeds. Arthur Finch was a collector of such ghosts, a young journalist from Boston, with a sharp suit, a sharper intellect, and a cynical heart. He had come west to capture what was left of its fading spirit before it vanished completely. He was looking for a story, a real one, something with the grit of the land still clinging to it, a story that would make his name in the Eastern papers. He had heard them all, the exaggerated tales of gunfighters and gold strikes. But one story, a whisper he had first heard in a dusty saloon near the Arizona border, had snagged his imagination. It was the story of the Red Woman and her Apache warrior. It was a fractured tale, told in a dozen different ways. Some said she was a captive who had fallen in love with her captor. Others said she was a witch who had cast a spell on a fearsome renegade. Most agreed they had been killers, leaving a trail of bodies across the territory before vanishing into the mountains near the border, a place no sane man would follow. It was the stuff of cheap novels. And yet there was a strange persistence to the legend, a thread of something that felt like truth. Arthur was determined to find it. His search took him months. He traveled from one sun-bleached town to another, his notebook filling with contradictory accounts and drunken ramblings. The trail was 2 decades old, covered by the shifting sands of time. He was about to give up, to dismiss the story as just another frontier campfire tale, when he found himself in a small, forgotten trading post south of the Gila River. The proprietor was an old man named Elias, his face a leather mask, his eyes a pale, watery blue that seemed to hold the memory of all the sunsets he had ever seen. Arthur asked his usual questions, expecting the usual answers. But Elias did not spin a wild yarn. He grew quiet, a thoughtful, distant look in his eyes. "You are not the first to come looking for that story," he said, his voice a dry rustle like leaves skittering across hardpan. "The others, they came looking for blood and thunder, for a story to sell. What are you looking for, son?" Arthur, for the first time in his journey, found himself giving an honest answer. "The truth, I suppose, whatever that is." Elias studied him for a long, silent moment, his gaze seeming to strip away the young journalist's cynicism and ambition. Looking for the man beneath, finally, he nodded slowly. "The truth is not a thing you find at the end of a gun barrel," he said. "It is a quiet thing, and it lives in a quiet place." He drew a crude map on a piece of brown wrapping paper, a series of squiggles and landmarks that meant nothing to Arthur. "Follow the dry wash of the Coyote until you see the mountain that looks like a sleeping man," he said. "Go toward the heart of the mountain. If they want you to find them, you will. If they do not, you will wander until the desert claims you. And if you do find them, you go with respect. You leave your world and its noise behind." Arthur followed the old man's map. He traded his rented motorcar for a sturdy mule and set off into the borderlands. It was a journey back in time. The world of telegraphs and railroads fell away, and he was alone in a vast, silent cathedral of rock and sky. After 3 days of travel, when he was beginning to believe he was on a fool's errand, he saw it, a high, rugged mountain range on the horizon, its silhouette exactly like the shape of a man lying in repose. He headed for its heart. He found the valley not by map, but by the sound of water. The faint, musical trickle of a creek led him through a narrow, hidden pass and into a place that should not have existed. He saw a small collection of neat adobe homes, a field of green corn, and a group of children playing by the water's edge. A man, his long black hair streaked with gray, looked up from his work tanning a deer hide. His face was calm, but his eyes were watchful. There was no hostility in his gaze, But there was a clear, unspoken question. Arthur dismounted, feeling like an intruder, a clumsy trespasser from another world. "My name is Arthur Finch," he said, his voice sounding overloud in the peaceful valley. "I was told a story about a woman named Eleanor Hayes and a warrior named Taza." The man's watchful expression did not change, but a flicker of something, a deep and ancient memory, moved in his eyes. He said nothing, but simply turned and led Arthur toward the largest of the adobe homes. An old woman sat in the shade of a cottonwood tree, weaving a basket. She looked up as they approached, her face a beautiful, intricate web of wrinkles, her eyes dark and full of a quiet wisdom. The man spoke to her in a language Arthur did not understand. The old woman listened, then turned her gaze on Arthur. It was a gaze that seemed to see right through him. "I am Kai," the man said, his English slow and carefully measured. "She is my grandmother. The children you see are her great-grandchildren. The story you seek is our story. It is the story of how we came to be." For the rest of the day, Arthur sat with them, not as a journalist, but as a guest. They shared a simple meal of corn cakes and roasted rabbit. As the sun began to set, Kai began to speak. He told Arthur the real story, not the legend. He spoke of a brave woman who had saved a wounded man, of a terrible chase and a desperate fight. He spoke of the long journey across the desert and of the hidden valley they had found. He spoke of how the Red Woman had taught the children their letters, and how the warrior Taza had taught them the old ways. He spoke not of heroes and villains, but of two people who had found a home in a world that had cast them out. When he was finished, a deep twilight had settled over the valley. He stood up. "Come," he said. "There is one more thing you must see." He led Arthur to the small, simple home where Eleanor and Taza had lived. It had been preserved exactly as they had left it. A thick layer of dust covered everything, a blanket of years. On a small wooden table sat a rusted tin box. Kai opened it with a quiet reverence. Inside, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was a book. Its leather cover was worn, its pages yellowed and fragile. It was Eleanor's journal. "You seek the truth," Kai said, his voice a low murmur. "Her truth is in here. Read it, understand." Arthur sat at the small table, and by the light of a single candle, he began to read. He read of Eleanor's lonely life in Red Mesa, of her grief for her lost husband. He read of the dust storm and the wounded man she had dragged into her storeroom. He read of her terror, of her reluctant compassion, of the slow, dawning love that had taken root in the middle of fear and danger. Her voice, clear and honest, spoke to him across the years. He was no longer a journalist chasing a story. He was a witness. He read through the night, the world of his own time, of newspapers and deadlines. Fading away completely, he reached the last pages, the entries written here in this valley. They spoke of peace, of the joy of building a life, of the deep, quiet love she shared with Taza. And then he came to the final entry. The handwriting was faint, a little unsteady, but the words were as clear and strong as the woman who had written them. He read the last lines aloud, his voice a whisper in the silent, dusty room. "They say this West is only land, guns, and blood, but I have seen that it also holds love, wild, true, and asking no one's permission." Arthur closed the journal. He finally understood. He had come looking for a story about the death of the Wild West, but he had found a story about its enduring heart. The real legacy of this land was not in the battles or the legends, but in the quiet acts of courage and compassion, in the defiant, stubborn insistence of the human heart to find a home, to love, to create a space of peace in a violent world. Freedom was not just a word in a book of laws. It was the sacred space two people had carved out for themselves, against all odds. And the people who had been rejected by that world, the outcasts and the survivors, were the ones who had guarded its truest, most humane secrets. He left the valley at dawn, his heart full, his notebook empty. The story did not belong in a newspaper. It was too quiet, too sacred for that. It belonged in a book, a slim volume to be written with care and respect, a tribute, not an expose. As he reached the pass, he turned for one last look at the hidden valley, a slash of impossible green in the red and brown land. He knew he would never come back. The song of the dust was a song of memory, of love, of the enduring strength of the human spirit, and it was a song that would now, always, sing inside of him. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the heart of the Old West. I invite you to comment below and let us know where you are listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please remember to subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales. Like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.